Hello and welcome to Hans Wargaming. In this video I'm going to show you how to make a bunch of different firewood stacks that can be used as scatter terrain. For this project I decided to use real wood. I went out in my yard and cut down a few saplings, cut a few branches off, and brought them into my house. It's mid-autumn right now, which is a good time to harvest sticks, in my opinion. Most of the leaves have already fallen off the trees, and it's too cold for most bugs. I think I might actually make a separate video for processing sticks for crafting purposes, because I feel like there's a lot that I'm going to be glossing over here just for the sake of time. But anyway, the branches that I chose were about a ½ inch thick or smaller, because I'm going to cut them into little mini logs, and that's about as thick as I wanted them to be. These are fresh branches, so the first thing I had to do was dry them out. To expedite this process, I cut them up into foot-long pieces and put them in my oven for a couple hours at the lowest possible temperature I could get, which was 170 degrees for my oven. A good pruner is an absolute must for this project. I do occasionally do some gardening, so I already had a pair, but they were pretty cheap and dull, so I actually went out and bought another pair for this project. I cut the smaller branches into small pieces, about a ½ inch to 3/4 inches long, or 2 to 2.5 centimeters. To speed this up, I cut a few branches at a time. I felt like it helped to angle them down into a container that kind of keeps them from shooting all over the place, which they'll still do, but not as many of them. To cut the bigger pieces, I used my table saw, and I actually built a sled for my table saw specifically for this project because I needed to make zero clearance cuts, which if you're not into woodworking, it just means that there's as little room as possible on either side of the blade, and that's going to keep these tiny pieces from getting wedged in between the blade and the support surface and turn it into little bullets. I tried cutting a few of these at once, but it wasn't really working. I ended up constantly having to realign them, and it ended up taking more time than it would just to cut individual pieces. So I think cutting one piece at a time is the way to go here. If you're into woodworking, you probably already know this, but yeah, make sure you use eye protection here, because every once in a while, one of these is going to fly somewhere. And of course, you don't have to use a table saw for this. You could use a hobby saw. You could use probably dozens of other types of saws. However you choose to do this, just make sure you're being safe and don't cut yourself. So I wanted to split these logs kind of like you would with actual firewood. And I had the idea to use a Phillips head screwdriver for this, to split these logs into 4 sections. I tried just using it as is, but it kind of just mashed the wood. So I tried to sharpen it, first with my angle grinder, which turned out to not be the best tool for this. I tried using a file, but that was taking too long. Eventually I just settled on using my Dremel. And it certainly wasn't the cleanest looking tool, but it did work. Of course, you could also use a chisel for this, but let's be honest, it's just not as fun. It also cuts it rather than splitting it, which isn't really desirable here. If you've done this correctly, the bark is probably going to hold most of the pieces together and you can just peel them apart. You can use a pruner to split them as well. And here's how many logs I did for this project. I didn't actually measure these, but I would guess I did 3 cups of each. 3 cups of smaller branches, 3 cups of full-size logs, and 3 cups of split logs. By the way, if you're going to use an oven to dry these disposable aluminum trays work pretty well. They're nice and deep and they can hold a lot of sticks. I also kept a few long pieces for crafting. These are about 8 inches long. So at this point, I'm just going to show you how I made a couple different firewood stacks. And then later on, I'm going to show you a couple different variants that I made. I wanted to make a couple different variants of these so I could use them for just about any setting. And I think I did a pretty good job with that. If there's any setting that you think I missed, let me know in the comments below. As you can see here, I'm just starting off with a basic log stack. I made all of my firewood stacks high enough to be used as barricades, but none of them can be used as full cover, with the exception of the sheds that we're going to be making in a few minutes. I made 3 different versions of the stacks. Using the smaller branches, I made a couple of these crisscrossing stacks. I made most of these 5 layers high, and then I also made some stacks where the logs are all facing the same direction. My strategy for this was to use super glue and accelerant for the first layer, and then just super glue for the following layers. That's because when you use accelerant, you get that white crust, and I was trying to keep that hidden, at least as much as possible, so I didn't have to clean it up later. And you'll also notice that if I have a larger log that's going to be on the bottom layer, I'll shave off a little bit so it sits flat. Also, I'm assembling this on a glass cutting board, so I have a nice flat surface. If you assemble a pile of logs and it isn't quite sitting flat, you can always just use some sandpaper. I also wanted to do a couple wood sheds. For that, I just used stir sticks and these little craft sticks. They're about the size of matchsticks. I found that it was easier to assemble the sides and the bottom first. Something like this would probably be used for a more modern game. I'm actually planning on making some more rustic sheds and like lean-tos, but that's going to be a separate video. Once you have the sides and the base together, it's a lot easier to glue the back on and then the roof. For these, I chose to use corrugated cardstock as the roof. If you want to use these for more of a fantasy setting, you could probably just switch this out for some shingles. And then you just glue some logs in there. For this one, I decided to do some split logs on one side and whole logs on the other. This goes for pretty much any of these builds, but if you ever have like a gap that you feel like is too big, you can probably just squeeze a smaller branch in there just to fill the space. I did prime the roof off camera, just using some spray paint. And there you go, just a mini for scale. I'm going to be staining this a little bit, but this is pretty much what it looks like. I made 3 sheds in total, and here I'm going in with a wash. This is just isopropyl alcohol mixed in with burnt umber paint. I used that to give everything a little bit of a faded look, and then I also kind of blended that into the logs a bit. This is another variant that I made, just some logs stacked between 2 stumps. With branches, if you cut them the right way, like right here, and then turn it upside down, that's kind of going to look like a trunk or a taller stump. You can whittle these down a bit to make them look a little bit more like a stump that was cut off. Or you can do what I did and make it look like the tree had split and fallen down naturally. To do this, I just lobbed some big sections off with the pruner. Then I used my nippers to twist and tear some pieces off. Probably better to use some pliers for this. Razor blade's really useful here as well. You can kind of scrape the bark off just to enhance the look. At that point, I did some touch-ups, cleaning up any spots where the white crust from the super glue was still visible. And I also had kind of like some orangish tint on some of these logs. I think it's mainly due to the type of tree that I was sourcing these from, but I wanted to try and hide that, so I did kind of go over some of the logs with a wash, which I think gives these stacks a more realistic look anyway. I will say that if you're using a wash for these, it's very easy to go overboard. So if you're going to try that, just start with a very, very thinned down brown and just work your way up. It all depends on the look you're going for. Here's the basic firewood set that I did. I don't know why people always opt to hide that wood grain when they're crafting. I think you can make it look really good with minimal effort. Alright, now we're going to do some winter versions of these. So one thing to consider here is that you might want to stain the logs to actually make them darker so that there's more contrast with the snow. And it just kind of makes sense that if there is snow on the logs, then that means that they probably have already gotten wet and they've probably already been in the weather for quite a while. So they would probably be a little darker. But anyway, a lot of it is just up to your preference and the look you're going for. I did a couple stacks with some stained wood and I did some without, just to show you what they both look like. For the snow, I'm using Vallejo ground texture. This stuff works pretty well, though it doesn't really lay like snow would. You kind of have to smooth it out, but it does work pretty well and I think it gives a pretty convincing look. When I'm applying this, I'll just kind of dab it onto the tops and then just kind of rake it down the sides. And then I just sprinkle Snowflakes by Woodland Scenics over top of that. I think these two products work pretty well together. For this one, I felt like the top was a little too flat, so I went back in and kind of gave it a little bit more texture, pushing down where there would be gaps between the logs. And here's what these look like. Yeah, personally, I kind of like the logs that are stained a little more. I think that contrast really helps, especially on a snowy map where you need something to break up that white. But I think they both look good. And finally, we're going to do some mossy logs. So originally, I think I was kind of shooting for something like this, but they ended up looking a little bit more like this. It wasn't a smooth process, but eventually I got there and I ended up really liking the way these came out. Initially, I just applied wood glue and flock. Realized that I probably should have made more of like a paste for this. So I did that using wood glue, paint, and flock. My initial mixture was way too vibrant, so I mixed up more of like an olive color. I don't think it looked terrible at this point, but it was just one of those projects where you just keep tinkering with it and tinkering with it, and you just don't really know when to stop. I gave it like this green wash, and then it just felt like it was way too green. I ended up really darkening them up with a blackish brown wash to knock that green back a bit. I was having a hard time getting the green right. I ended up mixing up a second batch of moss, and this time I used bright yellow green by Pro Acryl. By the way, if you're looking to get some Pro Acryl paints, we're now officially a Monument Hobbies Monumental, which means if you use the affiliate link in the description, I get a little bit of affiliate income from that, which is always nice. I've been a huge fan of Pro Acryl paints. They are currently my favorite brand of paints, and I'm pretty thrilled to be working with them. Maybe someday I'll have a spooky 6-pack of signature paints. All right, that's enough shilling. So you can see I slopped that on there pretty heavily. This is what they looked like after they dried. I went back in with the bright yellow green, just spot dry brushing all of the mossy areas to build up some highlights. And finally, I went in with some Army Painter Swamp Tufts. These do have a sticky side, but I like to use super glue just to make sure that they're going to stay in place. I put like 3 or 4 of these on each pile. I think that really helped sell the look. So that's about it for this video. I hope it gave you some scattered terrain ideas. Firewood stacks are one of those things you can use in a lot of different settings. Definitely something I think is worth building. As always, thank you to our patrons for the support. I don't really do a lot of sponsorships. This channel is mainly patron supported. So if you want to help support this channel, check out the link below. We also got affiliate links, like I said before. That's it for now. Hope you have a good day, and I will see you later.